Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead as Lila Grant pushed her industrial mop across the sterile hospital floor. Each flash a warning that Hurricane Nora was intensifying by the hour. At 2:00 a.m., Coastal Mercy Hospital felt like a fortress under siege. Windows rattled violently as 150-mile winds battered the building. Backup generators hummed ominously in the basement, and the relentless wail of emergency sirens cut through the storm's fury. Lila's shoulders ached from 12 hours of cleaning, her third job in a grueling schedule that barely kept her and her father afloat. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the wet linoleum as she worked, earbuds playing soft music to drown out the hurricane's relentless roar. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows so hard it sounded like machine gun fire, and every few minutes the entire building shuddered as another gust threatened to tear it apart. She paused to wipe sweat from her brow, glancing at the weather report on her cracked phone screen. Hurricane Nora had strengthened to a Category 4, the worst storm to hit South Florida in decades. The storm surge was already flooding streets throughout the city, and wind speeds were still climbing. Part of her wondered if she should have evacuated like so many others, but she couldn't afford to miss work. Not when her father's medical bills kept piling up, not when every dollar mattered. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In that moment of near darkness, her phone rang. The ringtone cut through her music like a knife, and Lila's blood turned to ice when she saw the caller ID, Coastal Mercy Emergency Department. Her hands trembled as she yanked out her earbuds and answered. "Miss Grant," the voice was urgent, professional, terrifying. "This is Dr. Martinez from the emergency department. Your father has been rushed into emergency surgery. His heart is failing." The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the floor as the words echoed in her mind. Heart failing, emergency surgery? The world tilted sideways, and she had to grip the mop handle to keep from collapsing. "No, no, no," she whispered, scrambling to pick up the phone. "Dr. Martinez, are you there? Please tell me, Miss Grant. You need to get here immediately. We're doing everything we can, but a massive gust of wind shook the building so violently that the call cut out." Lila stared at her phone screen in horror. No signal. The cell towers must be down. Her father was dying, and she was trapped on the wrong side of the city in the worst hurricane in decades. Lila abandoned her mop and ran for the employee exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. The automatic doors fought against her as she pushed through, the wind immediately trying to slam them shut. The moment she stepped outside, the hurricane's full fury hit her like a physical blow. The wind was a living thing, screaming and clawing at her with invisible hands. It knocked her sideways into a parked car, rain stinging her face like needles. Streetlights swayed dangerously overhead, some already snapped and dangling by their wires, throwing sparks into the storm. The parking lot was a lake of knee-deep water, debris floating past like deadly projectiles. Her car, a 15-year-old Honda with more rust than paint, sat partially submerged 20 yards away. Lila waded through the floodwater, fighting against the current that tried to sweep her feet out from under her. By the time she reached her car, she was soaked to the bone and shivering despite the warm night air. "Please start," she prayed, turning the key. "Please, God, just this once." The engine turned over weakly, coughed, and died. "No." She slammed her fist against the steering wheel, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "Not now. Please, not now." She tried again and again, but the engine was flooded. Dead. Her father was dying across the city, and she had no way to reach him. That's when she saw it. A delivery truck sitting higher up in the parking lot, abandoned but running. The driver must have fled when the storm got too bad, leaving it unlocked with the keys still in the ignition. Lila had never stolen anything in her life, but her father was dying. She waded through the flood to the truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and put it in drive. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the absent owner. "I'll bring it back. I swear." The truck was higher off the ground than her car, better able to handle the flooding, but driving through the hurricane was like navigating hell itself. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the torrential rain, and the wind kept trying to push the heavy vehicle off the road. Fallen trees blocked entire streets, forcing her to take detours through neighborhoods that looked like war zones. Power lines snapped and fell around her like angry snakes, throwing showers of sparks across the flooded pavement. She had to duck as a metal roof panel flew over the truck, and when she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw it embed itself in the side of a building like a giant blade. A traffic light torn from its pole crashed down just feet in front of her, and she screamed as she swerved around it. The truck hydroplaned, spinning sideways, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to flip. But the tires found traction again, and she managed to regain control. She was crying now, openly sobbing as she fought through the storm. Her father's face flashed in her mind. His gentle smile, his calloused hands that had built her treehouse, the way he'd held her when her mother died in that tornado 15 years ago. He was all she had left in the world, and she was going to lose him. The hospital was only 2 miles away now, but it might as well have been 200. The streets were rivers, cars abandoned and partially submerged everywhere. She had to drive on sidewalks, through parking lots, anywhere she could find passage. A massive oak tree had fallen across the main road leading to the hospital, its trunk easily 4 feet thick. There was no way around it, no way over it. Lila sat there for a moment, defeated, watching the wipers fight a losing battle against the rain. Then she saw another set of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A black luxury SUV that looked expensive enough to cost more than she made in 5 years. It stopped on the other side of the fallen tree, and she could see the driver's silhouette through the storm. They were both trapped, both trying to reach the same place. That's when Lila made a decision that would change everything. She backed up the truck, gunned the engine, and rammed it into the side of the tree trunk. The impact threw her forward against the steering wheel, but the tree shifted slightly. She backed up and hit it again, harder this time. The SUV's driver must have understood her plan because suddenly he was ramming the tree from the other side. Together, they managed to shift it just enough to create a narrow passage. Lila squeezed the truck through first, scraping against the bark, and when she looked back, she saw the SUV following. For just a moment, their headlights illuminated each other through the storm, and she caught a glimpse of the other driver, a man with dark hair and intense eyes, his face etched with the same desperate urgency she felt. The hospital was just ahead now, its emergency lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But as they both raced toward the entrance, disaster struck. A massive gust of wind caught Lila's truck at the worst possible moment, just as she was turning into the hospital parking lot. The vehicle hydroplaned on the flooded asphalt, spinning out of control. She saw the black SUV looming in her headlights, saw the other driver's eyes widen in shock, and then they collided with a sound like thunder. Both vehicles came to rest against each other, steam rising from their crumpled hoods. For a moment, Lila sat stunned, her ears ringing, tasting blood from where she'd bitten her tongue. Then reality crashed back, and she scrambled out of the truck. The other driver was already out of his SUV, and in the harsh light of the hospital's emergency entrance, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his head by the rain, and the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as someone with serious money. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were filled with the same desperate panic she felt. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the wind, reaching toward her. "I'm fine," she shouted back, stumbling toward the hospital entrance. "I have to me father." She didn't finish the sentence, just ran for the doors. Behind her, she heard the man following, his footsteps splashing through the floodwater. They burst through the emergency department doors together, both soaked and wild-eyed, and the triage nurse looked up in alarm. "My father," Lila gasped, water dripping from her hair onto the floor. "Thomas Grant." They called, said he was in surgery. "His heart." "Room 3, the nurse said quickly. "But you can't." Lila was already running down the hall, her wet sneakers squeaking against the floor. She could hear the other man behind her, his presence somehow both comforting and confusing. Why was he following her? Why did he look as desperate as she felt? She reached the surgical wing just as all the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In that crimson half-light, she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams forever. The long, steady tone of a heart monitor flatline. Her father's heart had stopped beating at the exact moment the power failed, as if the storm had reached inside the hospital and stolen the last thing she had to lose. Lila collapsed against the wall, her legs giving out, and screamed into the hurricane's fury. Chapter 2. When Lightning Strikes Twice. The flatline alarm pierced through the emergency lighting like a banshee's wail, and Lila felt her world collapse into that single devastating sound. Her father was gone. After everything, the desperate race through the hurricane, the stolen truck, the crash, she was too late. No, 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 she lunged toward the operating room doors, but strong hands caught her shoulders, holding her back. "Miss, you can't go in there," a nurse said firmly, her face grim in the red emergency lighting. "That's my father," Lila screamed, fighting against the restraint. "Let me go to him." Through the small window in the operating room door, she could see the medical team working frantically over her father's still form. The emergency generator cast everything in harsh shadows, making the scene look like something from a nightmare. Doctors and nurses moved with desperate efficiency, their hands working to bring back a life that had already slipped away. "Please," Lila whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't let him die." The man from the SUV collision stood nearby, his expensive clothes still dripping from the storm. In the chaos, she'd forgotten about him, but now she noticed he was talking urgently to someone on his phone, his voice low but commanding. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "Get Dr. Sullivan here now." "Yes, I know about the hurricane. Charter a helicopter if you have to. Dr. Sullivan." Lila recognized that name. He was the top cardiac surgeon in the state, the one whose services her father's insurance would never cover. Why was this stranger calling him? Suddenly, the flatline alarm stopped. Through the window, she saw movement her father's chest rising and falling with mechanical precision as the medical team worked to stabilize him. "He's back," the nurse breathed, relief evident in her voice. "We've got him back." Lila's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall to the floor, sobbing with relief. Her father was alive, but for how long? And what condition would he be in when he woke up? The stranger ended his call and approached her carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lila looked up at him through her tears, really seeing him for the first time. He was handsome in a sharp, expensive way, the kind of man who clearly lived in a world far removed from hers. His dark hair was still damp from the storm, and his gray eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read: concern, guilt, something deeper. "Why are you here?" she asked, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Why did you follow me?" He seemed to struggle with the answer, opening and closing his mouth several times before speaking. "I have someone here too, someone I care about." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Lila was too exhausted to press him. The adrenaline that had carried her through the storm was fading, leaving her drained and hollow. "I'm Ethan," he said after a moment, crouching down to her level. "Ethan Cole." The name hit her like a physical blow. Ethan Cole, the billionaire who had destroyed her father's construction company 3 years ago. The man whose corporate lawyers had torn apart everything her family had built. The man she'd been taught to hate. "You," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "You're the one who ruined us." His face crumpled, and she saw genuine pain in his eyes. "Lila, how do you know my name?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but she was past caring about politeness. "I know who you are," he admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. "I've known for a while." Before she could respond, "Doctor." Martinez emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. His expression was grave as he approached them. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your father is stable for now, but I need to speak with you about his condition." Lila struggled to her feet, Ethan rising beside her. She noticed he didn't leave, and she was too scared to ask him to go. Somehow, his presence was comforting, even though she knew she should hate him. "The heart attack was massive," Dr. Martinez continued. "We've managed to restart his heart, but the damage is extensive. He needs a transplant soon. Without it, he has maybe days, maybe weeks. A transplant." Lila felt the world tilt again. How much would that cost? The surgery itself is around $1 million, Dr. Martinez said, but with the anti-rejection medications, monitoring, and rehabilitation, You're looking at close to $2, 5 million total. And that's if we can find a matching donor. 5 million. It might as well have been $2 billion. Lila made barely $30,000 a year, working 3 jobs. She had no insurance that would cover this kind of procedure, no savings, no family to turn to. There's also an experimental treatment that could help while we search for a donor. Dr. Martinez said gently, it could buy us precious time, but it's not covered by insurance. Lila stared at him, numb. She didn't need to ask how much. She could see it in his eyes, far more than she could ever afford. She laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the empty hallway. I have nothing. No money, no way to pay for any of this. There are programs, the doctor said quickly. Charity care, fundraising. How long do those take? Lila interrupted. How long before we could get approval? Doctor. Martinez hesitated. Usually several months, sometimes longer. He doesn't have months, she whispered, sinking back against the wall. That's when Ethan stepped forward. What if the money wasn't an issue? Both Lila and the doctor turned to stare at him. What if I told you I could have the full amount transferred to the hospital within the hour? Ethan continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. You would do that, Doctor? Martinez asked, clearly surprised. For a stranger? Ethan's eyes never left Lila's face. He's not a stranger to me. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Lila couldn't begin to understand. Why would the man who had destroyed her father's business now offer to save his life? What was his angle? What did he want in return? I can't accept that, she said finally. Though the words felt like they were being torn from her throat. I can't owe you that much money. What if it wasn't charity? Ethan asked quietly. What if it was a business arrangement? What kind of business arrangement? Her voice was suspicious, but she couldn't help listening. 30 days, he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the storm still raging outside. Give me 30 days of your time, and I'll pay for everything. The surgery, the treatment, the medications, all of it. 30 days of my time doing what? Ethan glanced at Dr. Martinez, who took the hint and excused himself to check on other patients. When they were alone, Ethan moved closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. I need someone to accompany me to social events, he said carefully. Business dinners, charity galas, that sort of thing. Someone to play the part of my girlfriend. Your girlfriend? Lila's voice cracked on the word. It would be fake, of course, he said quickly. Just for appearances. You'd have your own room, your own space. I wouldn't expect anything inappropriate. Lila studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Why me? You could hire any woman in Miami to play that role. Because, he said. And for a moment, his carefully composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. Because it has to be you. Before she could ask what he meant, the lights flickered back on. The main power had been restored, and the hospital suddenly felt less like a disaster zone and more like a place of healing. I need to think about this, Lila said, though they both knew she didn't have a choice. Her father was dying, and Ethan Cole was offering her the only way to save him. Of course, Ethan said, pulling out his phone. I'll have my lawyer draw up the contract, but Lila, he paused, his hand on her arm, the offer has conditions. What conditions? You'd need to live with me for the 30 days, in my penthouse. He hesitated, as if the next words were difficult to say. And you'd need to share my bed. Lila's eyes widened in shock. I thought you said, not like that, he said quickly. I have nightmares, severe ones. I haven't slept properly in years, and I can't afford to look weak in front of my business associates. If you're going to convince people we're together, you need to be there at night. It was the strangest request she'd ever heard, and yet, something in his voice made her believe he was telling the truth. There was a vulnerability there, a brokenness that matched her own. And if I say no, she asked. Though they both knew the answer. Then your father dies, Ethan said simply, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Outside, Hurricane Nora continued to rage, but inside the hospital, 2 people stood at a crossroads that would change everything. I'll do it, Lila whispered, the words barely audible. "I'll give you 30 days." Ethan closed his eyes, relief washing over his features. "Thank you. But I want to be clear about something," Lila said, her voice stronger now. "I'm doing this for my father, not for you. I still hate you for what you did to us." "I know," Ethan said quietly, "and maybe by the end of 30 days, you'll understand why I had to do it." As if summoned by their agreement, Dr. Martinez returned with a team of specialists. "Miss Grant, if you're ready, we'd like to move your father to the cardiac ICU, and Mr. Cole." He turned to Ethan with obvious respect. "Sullivan is flying in from Houston. He should be here within the hour." Lila watched in amazement as Ethan orchestrated her father's care with the efficiency of someone accustomed to getting things done. Phone calls were made, specialists were consulted, and within minutes, her father was being wheeled to the best cardiac unit in the state. As they followed the gurney down the hall, Lila couldn't help but notice how the hospital staff treated Ethan with deference, respect, and something that looked like gratitude. How many times had he been here before? How many lives had he saved with his money? "There's something else," Ethan said quietly, as they waited outside the ICU. "Something you should know before you agree to this." Lila turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "I've been in love with you for 3 years," he said simply. "Since the day I first saw you at the city council meeting, defending your father's work. I've been watching over you ever since, making sure you were safe, making sure you had what you needed." The confession hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible, isn't it?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph picture of her from her college graduation, taken from a distance. "I've carried this with me every day since then." Lila stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. If what he was saying was true, then everything she thought she knew about Ethan Cole was wrong. But if it was a lie, 30 days, she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. 30 days, and then this is over. 30 days, Ethan agreed. But something in his eyes suggested he was hoping for much more than that. Outside, Hurricane Nora began to weaken, but inside the hospital, a different kind of storm was just beginning. Chapter 3. Living in Glass Houses. Ethan's penthouse sat like a crystal palace atop Miami's most exclusive high-rise, offering a panoramic view of the city still recovering from Hurricane Nora's devastation. As Lila stepped out of the private elevator with her single duffel bag containing everything she owned, she felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole into a world that defied comprehension. The space was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly sterile. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated every wall, offering views of the ocean on one side and the glittering cityscape on the other. The furniture was sleek and modern, all clean lines and neutral colors, like something from an architectural magazine. Everything looked expensive and untouched, as if no one actually lived here. "This is it," Ethan said quietly, setting down her bag near the entrance. He'd been unusually subdued during the ride up, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his jaw set with tension. "It's beautiful," Lila said, though the word felt inadequate. Beautiful didn't capture the way the afternoon light streamed through the windows, painting geometric patterns across the marble floors. Beautiful didn't describe the way the space felt like a sanctuary suspended between earth and sky. "It's empty," Ethan replied, his voice barely audible. "I've lived here for 5 years, and it's still empty." There was something in his tone that made Lila look at him more closely. He stood with his back to her, staring out at the city below, his shoulders rigid with tension. Even in his expensive suit, he looked isolated, like a man standing alone on an island. "The master bedroom is through there," he said, nodding toward a hallway. "Your things. There's a walk-in closet. You'll find everything you need." Lila followed his gesture, her bare feet silent against the cool marble. The master bedroom was as stunning as the rest of the penthouse. A king-sized bed dominated the space, surrounded by more floor-to-ceiling windows. But it was the closet that took her breath away. It was larger than her entire apartment, with custom shelving and lighting that would make a department store envious. Hanging there, organized by color and style, were dozens of outfits in her exact size. Dresses, skirts, blouses, shoes, even underwear, all expensive designer labels, all perfectly tailored to her measurements. "What is this?" she called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face carefully composed but his eyes betraying his nervousness. "I told you there would be events. You'll need appropriate clothing. How do you know my size?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but the sight of all those clothes, clearly bought specifically for her, was deeply unsettling. He struggled with the answer, his composure cracking slightly. "I've been watching you for 3 years, Lila. I know your coffee order, your work schedule, the way you bite your lip when you're nervous. I know your size because I've memorized everything about you." The confession should have terrified her, but instead, it made her heart race in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. There was something about the way he said it, not like a stalker or a predator, but like a man who had been quietly, desperately in love for years. "This is insane," she whispered, running her fingers along a silk dress that probably cost more than she made in a month. "You're insane." "I know," he said simply. "But you're here, and that's all that matters." That evening, Lila tried to settle into her new reality. She'd called the hospital to check on her father's stable, but still critical, and then spent hours exploring the penthouse. It had everything. A gourmet kitchen that had clearly never been used. A home theater with seating for 12. A library filled with books that looked like they'd never been opened. But for all its luxury, the space felt like a beautiful prison. The windows that offered such stunning views also reminded her that she was trapped 40 stories above the ground, dependent on a man she barely knew and wasn't sure she could trust. Around midnight, she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. It started as a low moan, then escalated into something that sounded like pure terror screaming, thrashing. Words she couldn't make out, but that carried the weight of unbearable pain. Lila found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to, padding through the penthouse in her borrowed silk pajamas. The sounds were coming from the living room, and when she reached it, she found Ethan on the couch, still fully dressed, caught in the grip of what looked like the worst nightmare she'd ever witnessed. He was drenched in sweat, his body rigid with tension, his hands clenched into fists, so tight his knuckles were white. Words poured from his lips, fragments of memory that painted a picture of unimaginable horror. "Please don't. I'm sorry. I'll be good. Please don't hit me." The words were those of a terrified child, and Lila felt her heart break a little. This powerful man, this billionaire who could buy and sell her entire world, was reduced to a frightened little boy in his sleep. "Stop!" he gasped, his body convulsing. "Please stop." Lila knelt beside the couch, unsure of what to do. She'd heard that you shouldn't wake someone from a nightmare, but she couldn't bear to watch him suffer like this. "Ethan," she said softly, not touching him but keeping her voice calm and steady. "You're safe. You're home. You're safe." The sound of her voice seemed to penetrate whatever hell he was trapped in. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment she saw pure terror in them. Then recognition dawned, and he sat up so quickly he nearly fell off the couch. "Lila," he breathed, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you had to see that." "How often does this happen?" she asked, settling beside him on the couch. Up close, she could see the way his hands trembled, the way his breathing came, in short, sharp gasps. "Every night," he admitted, his voice barely audible, "sometimes multiple times. I don't sleep well." "What are the dreams about?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, distant. "Foster care," he said simply. "The things that happened to me before I was old enough to protect myself." Lila felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall of anger and resentment she'd built around her heart. She thought about her own childhood, about the love and security her parents had provided, and tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up without that safety net. "Tell me," she said quietly. "You don't want to hear the tell me," she repeated, more firmly this time. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally began to speak, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "I was 6 when my parents died in a car accident. No other family. So I went into the system. The first family seemed nice enough, the Weatherbys. They had a big house, other foster kids. Spoke about God and kindness and second chances." He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form, but behind closed doors, they were monsters. "They'd beat us for any infraction, real or imagined. Lock us in closets for hours, sometimes days, withhold food as punishment, and they were creative in their cruelty. They knew exactly how to hurt us without leaving marks that social workers would notice. Lila felt sick, imagining this powerful man as a helpless child. I was there for 2 years before I was moved to another family. The Hendersons were different. They didn't hit us, but they were cold, calculating. They took in foster kids for the monthly checks, nothing more. We were fed, clothed, housed, but never loved, never wanted. "How many families?" she asked softly. 7, he said without hesitation. 7 in 12 years. Some were better than others, but none of them ever felt like home. I learned early that the only person you can truly depend on is yourself. Is that why you have nightmares? The nightmares are mostly about the Weatherbys, he admitted. Mr. Weatherby had a particular punishment he liked. He'd lock me in a small closet under the stairs, no light, barely enough room to sit, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. He'd tell me I was worthless, that no one would ever love me, that I deserved everything that happened to me. The crack in Lila's chest widened into something that felt like compassion. She understood now why he'd built walls around his own heart, why he seemed so isolated despite his wealth and success. "I'm so sorry," she whispered simply. "I don't want your pity," he replied quietly, but there was no heat in his words. "It's not pity," she said honestly. "It's understanding. I lost my mother when I was 12. Tornado took her right in front of me. I know what it feels like to be broken by things you can't control." They sat in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows. Lila found herself studying his profile, seeing him with new eyes. The harsh lines of his face softened in the dim light, and she could almost see the scared little boy he'd once been. "Is that why you don't sleep in your bed?" she asked. He nodded. "Too vulnerable, too exposed. I can't relax enough to sleep properly unless I'm somewhere where I can see all the exits." "And you want me to share that bed with you?" "I know it's a lot to ask," he said quickly, "but having someone there, it helps. The nightmares aren't as bad when I'm not alone." Lila considered this, weighing his words against the strange pull she felt toward him. She should be afraid he was essentially a stranger, and she was completely at his mercy. But something about his vulnerability, his honesty, made her trust him in a way that defied logic. "Just sleeping," she said finally. "Nothing else." "Nothing else," he agreed, relief evident in his voice. "And I get to ask questions about my father's business, about why you destroyed it, about everything. I'll tell you whatever you want to know," he promised. "But maybe not tonight." Looking at him now exhausted, vulnerable, still trembling slightly from his nightmare, Lila felt the last of her energy drain away. The events of the past 2 days were catching up with her, and she was suddenly bone-deep tired. "Come on," she said, standing and offering him her hand. "Let's try to get some sleep." He looked at her hand for a long moment before taking it, his fingers warm and slightly rough against hers. Together, they walked to the bedroom, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the penthouse felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. As they settled on opposite sides of the massive bed, still fully clothed and careful not to touch, Lila found herself listening to the sound of his breathing. It was deep and even more relaxed than she'd expected. "Lila," he said softly in the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for staying, for not running away." She was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "I'm not staying for you," she said finally. "I'm staying for my father." "I know," he replied, but something in his voice suggested he hoped that might change. Outside, the city continued to recover from Hurricane Nora's devastation. But inside the glass penthouse, 2 broken people found a moment of peace in each other's presence. It wasn't love-enough yet, but it was the beginning of something that might eventually heal them both. For the first time in years, Ethan slept through the night without screaming. Chapter 4. The Masks We Wear. The Miami Beach Convention Center had been transformed into something that looked more like a palace than a disaster relief venue. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling despite the building's hurricane damage, and thousands of white roses adorned every surface, their sweet scent masking the lingering smell of floodwater and debris. It was the kind of opulent display that probably cost more than most people made in a year, all in the name of helping hurricane victims. Lila stood at Ethan's side, wearing a midnight blue silk gown that fit her like it had been made specifically for her body, which she was beginning to suspect it had. The dress was stunning, with a plunging neckline that made her feel both elegant and exposed, and a skirt that flowed like water when she moved. She'd never worn anything so expensive in her life, and she was terrified she'd spill something on it. "Remember," Ethan murmured as they approached the entrance, his hand warm against the small of her back. "We've been together for 6 months. We met at a gallery opening. You're studying architecture part-time while working as—" He paused, as if just realizing he didn't know what cover story to give her. "Art consultant," Lila supplied, surprising herself with how easily the lie came. "I help private collectors find emerging artists." "Perfect," he said, and she caught a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're a natural at this." "At lying, you mean?" "At surviving?" He corrected gently. "Sometimes they're the same thing." The ballroom was filled with Miami's elite, politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and socialites who had somehow managed to maintain their perfect appearances despite the city being devastated by a hurricane just days before. Lila felt like an imposter among them, even in her designer gown. But Ethan moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged. "Ethan, darling," a woman in a spectacular red dress swept toward them, her arms outstretched. She was probably 60, with silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, and jewelry that probably cost more than Lila's father's house. "How wonderful to see you supporting our cause." "Mrs. Langley," Ethan said smoothly, accepting her air kisses with practiced ease. "May I introduce my girlfriend, Lila Grant." "Lila, this is Eleanor Langley, one of Miami's most generous philanthropists." "Oh my, Mrs." Langley said, looking Lila up and down with shrewd eyes. "She's lovely, Ethan. Quite different from your usual type." "My usual type?" Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. But Lila felt him tense beside her. "You know what I mean, darling," she said. "Those ice queens you used to bring to these events. This one has warmth." She leaned closer to Lila, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "How did you manage to melt our resident iceberg?" Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, both from embarrassment and something that might have been anger. "I didn't know he needed melting," she said carefully. "Mrs." Langley laughed, a sound like crystal bells. "Oh, I like her, Ethan. She's got spirit. Don't let this one get away." As they moved through the crowd, similar conversations followed. Everyone seemed to know Ethan, and everyone had an opinion about his choice of companion. Some were politely curious, others barely concealed their disdain for the unknown woman on his arm. Lila found herself playing the role of devoted girlfriend with increasing ease, though she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone could see through her performance. "You're doing beautifully," Ethan whispered during a break in conversations. "I know this isn't easy." "Which part?" she asked. "Pretending to be in love with you, or pretending I belong in this world?" "Both," he said honestly. "But for what it's worth, you belong here more than most of these people." Before she could ask what he meant, they were approached by a man in an expensive tuxedo who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Cole," the man said with obvious reluctance. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Councilman Hayes," Ethan replied, his voice cooling noticeably. "I wouldn't miss an opportunity to help hurricane victims." "Of course not," Hayes said with a thin smile. "Though I'm surprised you're not too busy with your latest development project to attend charity events." Lila felt the tension between the two men like a physical presence. There was history here, and it wasn't pleasant. "Actually," Ethan said smoothly, "I've decided to indefinitely postpone the Bayfront project. The hurricane has made me realize there are more important things than profit margins." Hayes's eyebrows shot up. "Really? That's quite a change of heart. The old you would never walk away from $100 million development." "People change," Ethan said simply, and his hand found Lila's. Squeezing gently, "Sometimes you find something more important than money." As Hayes walked away, looking puzzled, Lila turned to Ethan with questions in her eyes. "What's the Bayfront project?" "Low-income housing," he said quietly. 300 units that were supposed to be demolished to make way for luxury condos. I've been fighting the residents in court for 2 years. And you're just giving up?" "I'm choosing differently," he said. And there was something in his voice that made her believe him. The evening continued with a seemingly endless parade of small talk and air kisses, But Lila found herself watching Ethan more closely, seeing things she hadn't noticed before. The way he listened intently when a hurricane victim spoke, even when no one else was paying attention. The careful way he navigated conversations, deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the cause. The quiet dignity with which he handled the subtle and not-so-subtle insults from people who clearly thought he didn't belong among them. It was during the silent auction that Lila saw something that changed everything. She'd been admiring a piece of artwork, child's painting of a rainbow over a flooded city, when she noticed Ethan writing on a bid sheet. The minimum bid was $50, and most people had ignored it in favor of more expensive items. But Ethan was writing down an amount that made Lila's breath catch. $50,000. "Ethan," she whispered, touching his arm. "You can't be serious." "It's for a good cause," he said quietly, but his eyes were fixed on something across the room. Following his gaze, Lila saw a little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing with her parents near the auction display. The girl was staring at the painting with obvious pride, and Lila realized it must be hers. "My family lost everything in the hurricane," the girl was saying to anyone who would listen. "But I painted this picture because Mama said we should always look for rainbows after the storm." Most people were ignoring her, too busy with their own conversations to pay attention to a child. But Ethan was watching her with an expression Lila had never seen before. Pure, unguarded tenderness. "That's her painting," Lila said, understanding flooding through her. "She's been standing there for an hour," Ethan said softly, "waiting for someone to bid on it. No one has. So, you're going to pay $50,000 for a child's painting?" "I'm going to pay $50,000 to make sure she knows her art matters," he corrected. "There's a difference." As the auction results were announced, Lila watched the little girl's face light up when she heard that her painting had sold for an incredible amount. The girl's parents were crying, and Lila realized that $50,000 probably meant the difference between rebuilding their lives and starting over with nothing. But when a photographer approached to capture the moment, Ethan stepped back into the shadows, refusing to be photographed with his purchase. "Mr. Cole," the photographer called out, "don't you want to be recognized for your generous donation?" "No," Ethan said firmly, and when the photographer persisted, he actually stepped in front of the camera, blocking the shot. "If it's done for recognition, it's not truly generous." Later, as they walked through the hotel lobby, Lila found herself seeing him with completely new eyes. The man she'd thought was cold and ruthless had just spent $50,000 to make a child feel valuable, and he'd done it without wanting any credit. "That was beautiful," she said as they waited for the valet to bring his car. "What you did for that little girl, the way you made her feel special." "It was nothing," he said, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Just a small gesture." "It wasn't small to her," Lila said firmly, "or to her parents, or to me. I know what it's like," he said quietly. "To feel invisible. To feel like nothing you do matters. No child should feel that way." The ride back to the penthouse was quiet. Both of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they reached the building, the sky opened up with another fierce thunderstorm, rain lashing against the windows with hurricane-like intensity. "It's just a storm," Ethan said, noticing how Lila had tensed in her seat. "We're safe." But as they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, the thunder grew louder, and Lila found herself fighting a familiar panic. By the time they reached the 40th floor, she was trembling. "Lila," Ethan's voice seemed to come from far away. "What's wrong?" She couldn't answer. The sound of the storm had triggered something deep and primal memory she'd spent years trying to bury. Suddenly, she was 12 years old again, watching her mother get torn away by 100-mile-per-hour winds, helpless to do anything but scream. The elevator doors opened, and Lila ran for the bathroom, her elegant gown trailing behind her. She barely made it before her knees gave out, and she found herself on the cold marble floor, hyperventilating as the storm raged outside. The thunder crashed overhead, and in her mind, she was back in that trailer park, watching the tornado approach like a monster made of wind and debris. She could hear her mother's voice, calm and steady, even as the sky turned to chaos. "Lila, baby, I need you to get in the bathtub right now." "What about you, Mama? I'll be right behind you, sweetheart." "I promise." But she hadn't been right behind her. She'd been caught by the wind, lifted and thrown like a rag doll, and the last thing Lila had seen was her mother's terrified face disappearing into the storm. Lila. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm, cutting through the memory. You're safe. You're with me. And you're safe. She looked up to find him kneeling beside her, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled, his face etched with concern. Without thinking, she reached for him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she sobbed. It's just a storm, he murmured, his hand smoothing her hair. It can't hurt you here. She promised, Lila whispered against his shirt. She promised she'd be right behind me. Tell me, Ethan said softly. And somehow, in the safety of his arms, she found the strength to speak. She told him about that terrible day, about watching her mother die, about the years of guilt and survivor's remorse that followed. She told him about the nightmares, about the way thunderstorms still made her feel like that terrified 12-year-old girl hiding in a bathtub while her world was torn apart. I couldn't save her, she finished, her voice breaking. She died because of me. No, Ethan said firmly, pulling back to look at her. She died because of a tornado, a natural disaster, not because of anything you did or didn't do. But if I hadn't been there, if she hadn't had to worry about me, she would have died anyway, he said gently but firmly. But you're alive because she loved you enough to save you. Don't dishonor her sacrifice by blaming yourself for surviving. The storm continued to rage outside. But somehow, in Ethan's arms, Lila felt safe for the first time in years. He held her until her breathing steadied, until the panic subsided, until she was just a woman in a beautiful dress being comforted by a man who understood what it meant to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. Thank you, she whispered against his neck, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with rain. For what? For not making me feel weak. You're not weak, he said firmly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. As the storm began to quiet, Lila became aware of their position. She was practically sitting in his lap, her arms around his neck, their faces inches apart. She could feel his breath against her lips, could see the way his eyes had darkened with something that wasn't just concern. Lila, he said softly, her name barely a whisper. She knew she should pull away, should put distance between them, but she couldn't seem to move. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in despite every rational thought in her head telling her to be careful. This is dangerous, she said. But she didn't move away. I know, he replied, his thumb brushing across her cheek to wipe away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I still hate you, she said, but the words had no heat behind them. I know, he said again, and then his lips were so close to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But then sanity returned, and Lila pulled back, breaking the spell. I can't, she said, scrambling to her feet. I can't do this with you. I understand, Ethan said, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Do you? She asked, smoothing down her wrinkled dress. Because I'm not sure I understand anything anymore. She fled to the bedroom, closing the door behind her, but she could still feel the phantom warmth of his arms around her, still taste the possibility of that almost kiss on her lips. Outside, the storm finally began to pass, but inside the penthouse, a different kind of tempest was just beginning to brew. Lila lay in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that everything had changed between them tonight. She'd seen the man behind the mask, and he'd seen her at her most vulnerable. The question was, what were they going to do about it? Hours later, when she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed not of tornadoes and death, but of strong arms and gentle voices, of a man who understood her pain because he carried his own, and of the dangerous possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could heal each other's broken places. But in the morning, she would have to decide whether she was brave enough to try. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Storm. 3 days after the charity gala, Miami was battered by another fierce storm, not a hurricane this time, but a vicious thunderstorm that turned the sky black as midnight at 3:00 p.m. Rain hammered against the penthouse windows with supernatural force, and lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating the city in stark, dramatic flashes. Lila stood in the kitchen, making coffee with shaking hands as thunder rolled overhead like the footsteps of angry gods. Since the night she'd broken down in Ethan's arms, they'd been dancing around each other like two wild animals who were simultaneously attracted and terrified. He'd been gentler with her, more careful, and she'd caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with the calculating gaze of a businessman, but with something that looked dangerously like tenderness. The power flickered, and Lila cursed under her breath as the coffee maker died mid-brew. She'd been hoping to finish before the storm got worse, but Miami's electrical grid had never been known for its reliability during severe weather. "It's going to be a long night," Ethan said from behind her. And she turned to find him pulling emergency candles from a kitchen drawer. He'd changed out of his usual business attire into jeans and a black t-shirt, and the casual clothes made him look younger, more approachable. "Do power outages happen often?" she asked, accepting a candle from him and trying not to notice the way his fingers brushed hers. "Every time there's a decent storm," he replied, lighting his candle with a silver lighter. "The building has backup generators, but they only power essential systems. Everything else goes dark." As if summoned by his words, the lights died completely, plunging them into a world of candlelight and shadow. Outside, the storm seemed to grow stronger, wind howling around the building like something alive and angry. "I should check on my father," Lila said, reaching for her phone. But the cell towers were down, and she couldn't get a signal. "Damn it. The hospital has backup power and generator systems," Ethan said gently. "He's safer there than we are here." Lila nodded, trying to push down the familiar panic that rose whenever she couldn't contact the hospital. Her father was getting stronger every day. The experimental treatment Ethan was paying for was working. But she still woke up every morning afraid she'd get another call like the one during Hurricane Nora. "Come on," Ethan said, gesturing toward his study. "There's something I want to show you." The study was a room she'd barely entered during her week in the penthouse. It felt too personal, too much like intruding on his private space. But by candlelight, it looked differentless, intimidating, and more intimate, with shadows dancing across the walls and the scent of leather and old books filling the air. Ethan set his candle on the desk and moved to a large painting on the far wall, an abstract piece in blues and grays that she'd barely noticed before. To her surprise, he pressed something behind the frame, and the painting swung open like a door, revealing a wall safe. "Ethan," she said carefully, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his fingers working the combination lock. "You have questions about what happened to your father's business. You deserve answers." The safe opened with a soft click, and Ethan withdrew a thick manila folder. He set it on the desk between them, his hand resting on top of it as if he was reluctant to let it go. "Before you look at this," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt your family. Everything I did to protect you and your father." "Protect us from what?" Instead of answering, he opened the folder and spread the contents across the desk. By candlelight, Lila could see documents, photographs, financial records, and what looked like surveillance reports. Her breath caught when she recognized letterhead from Grant and Associates Construction, her father's company. "What is all this?" she whispered. "Evidence," Ethan said simply. "Evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal negligence." Lila picked up one of the documents, a financial report showing discrepancies in material costs and labor expenses. The numbers didn't make sense. Someone had been systematically inflating costs and pocketing the difference. "I don't understand," she said, but even as she spoke, a cold dread was settling in her stomach. "Your father's business partner, Victor Lane, was stealing from the company," Ethan explained, his voice carefully neutral. But it wasn't just embezzlement. He was also cutting corners on construction projects, using substandard materials and unsafe practices. He pulled out a photograph and placed it in front of her. It showed a building under construction, and even in the grainy image, she could see the problems. Improperly mixed concrete, inadequate rebar, structural shortcuts that would have been invisible to casual inspection. "This is the Riverside Elementary School project," Ethan continued. Lane was supposed to use earthquake-resistant materials and construction techniques. Instead, he used the cheapest materials he could find and falsified the inspection reports. Lila stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. That school, there are 300 children in that building every day. Were Ethan corrected gently. The building was condemned 2 weeks after I exposed Lane's practices. It was so structurally unsound that it would have collapsed in the next major earthquake, killing everyone inside. The folder contained more evidence. Dozens of projects where Lane had cut corners, falsified reports, and stolen money housing developments with faulty foundations, and office buildings with inadequate fire safety systems, a bridge that would have collapsed under normal traffic loads. My God, Lila breathed, her hands shaking as she leafed through the documents. All of these projects people could have died. People would have died, Ethan said firmly. It was only a matter of time. Lane was building death traps and calling them homes, schools, and offices. But her eyes caught on a document with her father's signature on ITAN approval for the Riverside Elementary project. My father, Lila's voice trailed off. Your father didn't sign off on these projects, Ethan said quietly. But I think he didn't know what Lane was doing, at least not consciously. Lila's hands shook as she continued reading. The evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning 3 years, with Victor Lane gradually taking control of more and more aspects of the business, while her father focused on the architectural design work he loved. Why didn't you come to my father with this? She asked. Why didn't you warn him? I tried, Ethan said, and there was pain in his voice. I sent anonymous tips to your father, to the building inspectors, to the city planning office. Everyone ignored them. Lane had connections, people in his pocket. No one wanted to listen to accusations without proof. So, you destroyed the entire company. I exposed the fraud, he corrected. I gathered enough evidence to force an investigation that Lane couldn't cover up or explain away. But yes, that meant destroying Grant and Associates Construction because the company was complicit in potentially lethal criminal activity. Lila sank into a chair, the weight of the truth crushing down on her. My father lost everything because of his partner's crimes. Your father would have lost everything anyway, Ethan said gently, and probably gone to prison as an accessory. When those buildings started collapsing, when people started dying, he would have been held responsible for every signature on every fraudulent document. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil in Lila's heart. Lightning flashed, illuminating the study in stark black and white, and thunder crashed so loudly that the windows rattled. There's more, Ethan said quietly, and he pulled out another document, a police report dated just days after Grant and Associates Construction was shut down. Lila read it with growing horror. Victor Lane had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide, but the police report contained troubling details, signs of a struggle, evidence that had been tampered with, and witness testimony that didn't quite add up. He killed himself, she whispered. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe someone killed him to keep him from talking. Lane had connections to some very dangerous people contractors with ties to organized crime, city officials who were taking bribes. When I exposed his operation, I didn't just destroy his business, I destroyed his entire network. And you think someone murdered him to keep him quiet? I think Victor Lane was in over his head with people who don't forgive betrayal, Ethan said carefully. Whether he killed himself out of fear or someone did it for him, I don't know. But either way, he's not around to face justice for what he did. Lila sat in silence, trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd blamed for destroying her family's livelihood had actually saved her father from prison or worse. He'd prevented potentially hundreds of deaths by exposing a criminal conspiracy that went far deeper than simple embezzlement. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked finally. Would you have believed me? Ethan asked quietly. 3 days ago, you hated me so much you could barely stand to be in the same room. If I'd told you your father's business partner was a criminal, would you have listened, or would you have assumed I was lying to justify my actions? She wanted to protest that she would have listened, but she knew he was right. 3 days ago, she would have dismissed any explanation he offered as self-serving lies. I need to talk to my father, she said, standing abruptly. I need to hear this from him. Lila, wait. But she was already moving toward the door, driven by a need to confront her father with the truth. The storm outside was getting worse, but she didn't care. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The drive to the hospital was treacherous, with flooding and fallen trees blocking several roads. But Lila's small rental car managed to navigate the obstacles, and she arrived at Coastal Mercy, soaked and shivering despite the warm night air. Her father was awake when she entered his room, sitting up in bed and looking stronger than he had in weeks. The experimental treatment was working. His color was better, his breathing easier, and he'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost during his illness. "Lila," he said with a smile that faded when he saw her expression. "Sweetheart, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Dad," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed, "I need to ask you about Victor Lane." The change in her father's expression was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and his hands began to shake. "What about Victor?" he asked carefully. "Did you know?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended. "Did you know what he was doing to the company? The fraud, the embezzlement, the unsafe construction practices?" Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I knew," he admitted. "I suspected toward the end. I started noticing things that didn't add up, materials that cost more than they should have. Inspection reports that looked different from what I remembered approving. Projects that were completed too quickly. But you didn't do anything about it." "I was scared," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Victor had connections people who scared me. He told me that if I asked too many questions, we'd both regret it. And I was sick, Lila. I'd already had 2 small heart attacks. And I wasn't thinking clearly. Dad, people could have died because of those buildings." "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know. I've been carrying that guilt for 3 years, wondering how many people I put at risk because I was too much of a coward to stand up to Victor." Lila felt her anger deflate, replaced by a deep sadness for the impossible position her father had been in. He wasn't a criminal. He was a sick, frightened man who'd been manipulated by someone he trusted. "Ethan Cole saved you," she said quietly. "When he exposed Victor, he saved you from going to prison. He saved you from being held responsible when those buildings collapsed." Her father's eyes widened in shock. "Ethan Cole, the businessman who destroyed our company?" "He didn't destroy our company, Dad. He saved your life. Maybe literally. Victor Lane died right after the investigation started. Ethan thinks he might have been murdered to keep him quiet." Thomas Grant stared at his daughter in amazement, processing this new information. "All these years, I thought he was our enemy." "So did I," Lila admitted. "But he's been protecting us. Dad paying for your medical care, making sure we were safe. He's been watching over us for 3 years." "Why?" her father asked. "Why would he do all of that for strangers?" Lila thought about Ethan's confession, about the photograph he carried, about the way he'd looked at her that first night during Hurricane Nora. "Because he loves me," she said quietly, the words feeling strange on her lips. "He fell in love with me 3 years ago, and he's been protecting us ever since." Her father reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "And how do you feel about him?" It was the question she'd been avoiding for days, the truth she hadn't wanted to face. But sitting here in the hospital room where her father was recovering from surgery that Ethan had paid for, surrounded by evidence of his protection and care, she finally had her answer. "I think I love him too," she whispered. "And that terrifies me." The drive back to the penthouse felt like the longest journey of her life. The storm was beginning to weaken, but rain still fell steadily, and her thoughts were churning with everything she'd learned. By the time she reached the building, she felt emotionally drained and physically exhausted. She found Ethan standing on the balcony, despite the rain, staring out at the storm-tossed city. He'd heard the elevator, but he didn't turn around when she approached. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was plastered to his head. "How is he?" he asked quietly. "Recovering," she said, moving to stand beside him at the railing. The rain immediately soaked through her clothes, but she didn't care. "He told me the truth about Victor," she said. Ethan nodded but still didn't look at her. "I know this changes things between us." "Yes," she said simply. "It does." "I understand if you want to leave," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I know this arrangement was difficult for you, and now that you know the truth, Ethan," she interrupted, and finally he turned to look at her. In the dim light from the penthouse, she could see the pain in his eyes, the fear that she was about to walk away from him. "You saved my father's life," she said, stepping closer to him. "Twice. Once from prison, and once from his heart condition. You've been protecting us for 3 years, and I never knew." "I didn't want your gratitude," he said quietly. "What did you want?" He was quiet for a long moment. rain streaming down his face like tears. "I wanted you to love me," he admitted finally. "Not because of what I could do for you, not because I saved your father or paid your bills. I wanted you to love me for who I am, despite everything I've done." Lila felt something shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling around her heart. This man, this powerful, wealthy, seemingly untouchable man was as vulnerable as she was. He'd built an empire, commanded respect and fear, but all he really wanted was to be loved. "I was so angry," she said, stepping even closer. "For 3 years, I hated you for destroying our lives, but you weren't destroying anything. You were saving us." "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear the years of guilt and regret in his voice. "I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. I'm sorry your father had to lose his company. I'm sorry you had to struggle because of my choices." "Don't apologize," she said firmly, reaching up to touch his face. His skin was warm despite the rain, and she could feel him tremble at her touch. "You did what you had to do. You chose to save lives over preserving our feelings, and that was the right choice." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating their faces in stark detail. In that moment, Lila saw herself reflected in his eyes, not as the poor girl he was helping out of pity, but as the woman he'd loved from afar for 3 impossible years. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be with someone like you." "Someone like me? Someone who loves so completely it changes everything," she said. "Someone who would sacrifice everything for the people he cares about." "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "Just don't leave. Don't walk away from this." Instead of answering with words, Lila rose up on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was everything the almost kiss in the bathroom hadn't been. Desperate, passionate, and completely without reservation. 3 years of longing, pain, and misunderstanding poured out between them. When lightning struck a building nearby, they barely noticed. Ethan's arms came around her, pulling her against him as if he was afraid she might disappear. She could taste the rain on his lips, could feel his heart hammering against her chest, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt completely safe in someone's arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm seemed to have quieted around them. The rain was gentler now, the thunder more distant, as if nature itself were holding its breath. "I love you," Lila said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "I love you, and it terrifies me. But I can't fight it anymore." "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you, and I'll love you until the day I die." As they stood there in the rain, holding each other on a balcony 40 stories above the city, Lila felt like her life was finally beginning. Everything that had come before, the pain, the struggle, the anger, had led her to this moment, to this man, to this love that felt strong enough to weather any storm. But she had no idea that their greatest test was still to come. Chapter 6. Love's Sweet Revolution. The morning after their confession in the storm, Lila woke to find herself curled against Ethan's chest, both still wearing their rain-soaked clothes from the night before. Sometime during the early hours, they'd moved inside and fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in each other's arms like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of driftwood. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden patterns across Ethan's sleeping face. In the gentle morning light, he looked younger, more peaceful than she'd ever seen him. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, and his mouth had lost the careful control he usually maintained. This was Ethan without his armor, and the sight made her heart ache with tenderness. "Good morning," he said softly, his eyes still closed, but a small smile playing at his lips. "How did you know I was awake?" she asked, not moving from her position against his chest. "Your breathing changed," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "And you stopped drooling on my shirt." "I do not drool," she protested, but she was laughing as she said it. "Just a little," he teased, and the easy intimacy of the moment took her breath away. This was what it felt like to be loved completely, to be teased, cherished, and accepted. Flaws and all. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's phone ringing. He answered it with obvious reluctance, and Lila could tell immediately that it was important business from the way his entire demeanor shifted. "Dr. Sullivan," he said, sitting up straighter. "Yes, I understand. How soon can we get him there?" Lila felt her stomach drop. "Is it my father?" she asked as soon as he ended the call. Good news, Ethan said quickly, seeing the panic in her eyes. The treatment is working better than expected. Dr. Sullivan wants to move up the timeline for the transplant surgery. There's a heart-available, perfect match. When? She asked, her mind already racing. Today. We need to get to Houston immediately. Within 2 hours, they were aboard Ethan's private jet, flying toward Texas with her father safely transported in the plane's medical bay. The aircraft was equipped with a full medical suite, and a team of specialists monitored Thomas Grant's condition throughout the flight. It was the kind of luxury that Lila was still learning to accept, having unlimited resources to ensure her father received the best possible care. I can't believe this is really happening, she said, gripping Ethan's hand as they watched the Texas landscape unfold below them. After all these months of uncertainty, he's actually going to get a new heart. He's going to be fine, Ethan said with quiet confidence. Dr. Sullivan is the best cardiac surgeon in the country. Your father couldn't be in better hands. Houston Methodist Hospital was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, representing the pinnacle of modern medical technology. As they rushed through the corridors toward the cardiac surgery wing, Lila marveled at how different this felt from that terrible night at Coastal Mercy during Hurricane Nora. This time, they weren't racing against disaster, they were racing toward hope. Dr. Sullivan met them personally, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and steady hands. He explained the procedure in terms Lila could understand, outlining the risks and benefits with compassionate honesty. The surgery will take approximately 8 hours, he said as they prepared to wheel her father into the operating room. Given his overall health improvements from the experimental treatment, I'm very optimistic about the outcome. Lila kissed her father's forehead as he was being sedated, whispering words of love and encouragement. He squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes already growing heavy from the preoperative medications. I love you, sweetheart, he managed to say. Take care of that young man of yours. He's good for you. As the operating room doors closed behind her father, Lila felt a familiar surge of panic. But this time, Ethan was there, his arm around her shoulders, his strength supporting her when her own threatened to fail. 8 hours, she said, looking at the surgical waiting room with its uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines. 8 hours, Ethan agreed. We can handle 8 hours. But as it turned out, they were there much longer than 8 hours. The surgery was complicated, requiring delicate work to remove scar tissue from her father's previous heart attacks. Then there were complications with the new heart's integration, requiring additional procedures to ensure proper blood flow. 12 hours after the surgery began, Lila was pacing the waiting room like a caged animal, while Ethan tried to work on his laptop to distract himself. Neither of them had eaten more than hospital vending machine snacks, and both were running on caffeine and nervous energy. This is taking too long, Lila said for the 100th time. Something's wrong. Dr. Sullivan said to expect complications. Ethan reminded her gently. Heart transplants are complex procedures. But 12 hours, Ethan. He closed his laptop and pulled her down beside him on the uncomfortable plastic chair. He's going to be okay. I know it. How can you be so certain? Because he has something to live for, Ethan said simply. He has you, and you need him. That's powerful motivation. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Sullivan finally emerged from the operating room, still in his surgical scrubs, but with a tired smile on his face. The surgery was a success, he announced, and Lila felt her knees nearly give out with relief. Your father is stable and responding well to the new heart. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic about his recovery. Lila burst into tears, not tears of fear, not the panicked sobs she'd shed so often over the past few months, but tears of pure joy and relief and gratitude. Ethan held her tight as she cried, and she could feel him trembling with his own emotions too. Can I see him? She asked when she could speak again. He's in the cardiac ICU, Dr. Sullivan said. You can see him briefly, but he won't be conscious for several hours yet. The ICU was a maze of monitors and medical equipment. But at the center of it all was her father, looking small and fragile in the hospital bed. But alive, the steady beat of his heart monitor his new heart was the most beautiful sound Lila had ever heard. Hello, Daddy, she whispered, taking his hand gently. You did it. You made it through. They stayed at the hospital for 3 days, waiting for her father to wake up and begin his recovery. The hotel Ethan had booked was luxurious, but Lila barely noticed the amenities. All her attention was on her father's progress, on the gradual improvements that Dr. Sullivan reported during his daily visits. On the third night, as they sat in their hotel room overlooking downtown Houston, Ethan finally persuaded her to talk about something other than her father's medical condition. "Tell me about your dreams," he said softly, pouring her a glass of wine from the bottle that room service had delivered. "Before everything happened with your father's illness, what did you want to do with your life?" Lila curled up in the oversized armchair, surprised by the question. It had been so long since anyone had asked her about her dreams that she'd almost forgotten she had any. "I wanted to be an architect," she said quietly, "like my dad. But not commercial buildings or luxury developments. I wanted to design homes for people who couldn't afford architects' low-income housing that was beautiful and functional and built to last." "That's beautiful," Ethan said, settling on the plush couch across from her. "What stopped you?" "Life," she said with a rueful smile. "When Dad's company collapsed, I had to drop out of architecture school to work full-time. Then he got sick, and all my energy went toward keeping us afloat financially." "But you still want it," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question." "Some dreams don't Lila admitted. "They just get buried under more immediate needs." "What if they didn't have to stay buried?" Ethan asked softly. "What if you could go back to school to finish your degree?" "Lila, I can't. You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering. I'm suggesting. I'm hoping." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Because I love you," he said simply. "And because I want to build something with you that's bigger than just us. I have resources, Lila. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But I don't have what you have. Vision, compassion, the ability to see what the world could be instead of just what it is." He set down his wine glass and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to design homes for people who can't afford architects. What if we started a foundation together? What if we created something that could change how low-income housing is built in this country?" Lila stared at him, her heart racing. "You're serious?" "Completely serious. The Lila Grant Foundation for Sustainable Housing. We could fund beautiful, environmentally conscious housing projects in underserved communities. We could change the way people think about affordable housing. But I'd need to finish my degree first, get licensed, gain experience. So, we'll make sure you get all of that," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever you need, however long it takes. I believe in your dream, Lila. Let me help you make it real." The conversation continued long into the night, with Ethan sharing his own dreams and aspirations. He told her about his plans to use his wealth for something meaningful, about his desire to leave a legacy that mattered. They talked about traveling together, about the places they wanted to see, and the experiences they wanted to share. "I never thought I'd have this," Lila said, as they finally prepared for bed. "Love, I mean. Real love with someone who believes in me." "I never thought I'd have it either," Ethan admitted. "I convinced myself that being alone was safer, that caring about someone just meant giving them the power to hurt you. And now I know that being hurt is a small price to pay for feeling this happy," he said, pulling her into his arms. Their first time making love was nothing like the passionate desperation of their kiss in the storm. It was slow and tender, a gentle exploration of each other's hearts as much as their bodies. Ethan worshipped her with a reverence that made her feel precious beyond measure, and when she touched him, she could feel years of loneliness melting away beneath her hands. Afterward, they lay entwined in the hotel bed, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the windows. "I love you," Lila whispered against his chest, the words still feeling miraculous on her lips. "I love you too," he replied, his voice heavy with contentment. "More than I ever thought possible." It was the happiest moment of Lila's life. Her father was recovering from successful surgery, she was in the arms of the man she loved, and the future stretched before them, filled with infinite possibility, which made what happened next all the more devastating. Ethan's phone rang at 6:00 a.m., jarring them both awake from deep, peaceful sleep. He answered it groggily, but Lila could see the exact moment when the caller's words registered, because his entire body went rigid with shock. What do you mean, investigation? He said, sitting up in bed. By whom? Lila watched his face pale as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end of the line. How long has this been going on? He asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. And you're just telling me now? The conversation lasted another 10 minutes, with Ethan asking increasingly urgent questions and receiving answers that clearly weren't what he wanted to hear. When he finally hung up, he sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. Ethan, Lila said carefully, what's wrong? The FBI has opened an investigation into my business practices, he said without looking at her. They're alleging fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. That's ridiculous, Lila said immediately. You're not a criminal. It doesn't matter what I am, Ethan said bitterly. It matters what they can prove. And apparently, someone has been very carefully building a case against me for months. Who would do that? I don't know, he said, but something in his voice suggested he had suspicions. But whoever it is, they've done their homework. They have documents, financial records, testimony from former employees. It looks very convincing. Lila felt a chill of fear run down her spine. What does this mean? It means everything is about to change, Ethan said quietly. My assets will be frozen pending the investigation. My companies will be placed under federal oversight, and if they decide to bring charges, I could go to prison for 20 years. He paused, his voice breaking. And more immediately, I won't be able to pay for your father's continued treatment. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father was still in critical condition, needing round-the-clock care and expensive medications to survive. Without Ethan's financial support, the hospital would stop treatment, and her father would die. There has to be something we can do, she said desperately. Maybe, he said, but he didn't sound hopeful. I have good lawyers, and I'm innocent of whatever they think I've done. But investigations like this can take years to resolve. And in the meantime, he didn't finish, but he didn't need to. In the meantime, her father would die, and the man she loved would be destroyed by false accusations. As they sat in the hotel room watching the sun rise over Houston, Lila realized that their brief moment of happiness was about to be torn away from them. The storm that had brought them together was nothing compared to the hurricane that was about to hit their lives. But she also realized something else. She wasn't going to let this destroy them without a fight. Whatever it took, whoever was behind this, she was going to find a way to save the man she loved and the father who needed her. The battle for their future was about to begin. Chapter 7. When Love Costs Everything. The federal courthouse in Miami looked like a fortress of justice, its imposing columns and granite facade designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge the power of the United States government. Lila sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as Ethan's team of lawyers fought desperately to prevent his life from being completely destroyed while the investigation continued. It had been 2 weeks since that devastating phone call in Houston, and every day had brought new horrors. The evidence against Ethan was overwhelming. Fabricated documents, forged records, testimony from people claiming he'd ordered them to commit crimes. Someone had spent months, maybe years, carefully constructing a web of lies that would be nearly impossible to escape. Your Honor, Ethan's lead attorney was saying, my client has cooperated fully with this investigation. Destroying his life at this stage would be premature and unnecessarily cruel. The federal prosecutor stood to respond. Your Honor, Mr. Cole poses a significant flight risk, and his continued access to his wealth could compromise this investigation. The judge listened to both sides before making his ruling that would change everything. Given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm ordering that Mr. Cole's assets be placed under federal oversight immediately. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and Lila felt her world shatter. Federal oversight meant that the money for her father's ongoing treatment would be cut off immediately. As they left the courthouse, Ethan was silent, his face a mask of controlled despair. It wasn't until they were in the privacy of his car that he finally spoke. How long can your father survive without the treatment? He asked quietly. Doctor, Sullivan says maybe 3 weeks, Lila replied, her voice barely audible. His body is still adjusting to the new heart, and without the anti-rejection medications, she couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what it meant. Her father would die slowly and painfully as his body rejected the heart that had saved his life. I have about $2 million in personal accounts that weren't frozen, Ethan said, staring straight ahead as he drove. "It's enough to cover his treatment for maybe 6 months. And your legal defense?" "My lawyers want a $5 million retainer to fight these charges properly," he said with bitter irony. Apparently, proving innocence is more expensive than buying guilt. They drove in silence through the Miami streets, both understanding the impossible choice that lay before them. Ethan could use his remaining money to hire the best legal team in the country, fight the charges, and possibly clear his name, or he could spend everything ensuring that her father survived, accepting that he would go to prison for crimes he didn't commit. That night, Lila found Ethan in his study, surrounded by documents and papers. He'd been working for hours, making phone calls, transferring funds with the methodical efficiency of a man preparing for his own execution. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Making sure your father gets the care he needs," Ethan said without looking up. "I've set up a medical trust fund in your name. It should cover his treatment for years to come." "Ethan." "No," Lila said, moving to stop him. "You need that money for your defense. You're innocent. We can prove it." "With what?" he asked, finally looking at her with eyes full of anguish. "Whoever set me up has been incredibly thorough. They have evidence that looks real, witnesses who will swear I'm guilty. Me innocence doesn't matter if I can't prove it." "Then we'll find a way to prove it," she said desperately. "We'll hire the best lawyers. I can't fight this and save your father," Ethan said quietly. "There's not enough money for both. So, I'm choosing him. I'm choosing you. There has to be another way," she whispered. "If there is, I haven't found it," Ethan said sadly. "And I've been looking for 2 weeks." The next morning, Lila pawned everything she owned of value: her grandmother's jewelry, her mother's wedding ring, even her father's architectural instruments. The total amount was pathetically small, barely enough to pay a lawyer for a few hours of consultation. But she was desperate to do something, anything, to help the man she loved. The lawyer she met with was sympathetic, but brutally honest about Ethan's chances. "The evidence against him is substantial," he said, reviewing the case files she'd brought. "Even with the best legal team in the country, this would be an uphill battle. And without proper funding for investigation and expert witnesses." "How much would it take?" Lila asked. "Realistically, how much money would we need to mount a proper defense?" "Minimum 7 million, he said. "Probably closer to 10 if we want to be thorough." 10 million. It might as well have been 10 billion. Lila left the lawyer's office feeling more hopeless than ever, but she refused to give up. She spent the next week reaching out to everyone she could think of: journalists who might investigate the case, private detectives who might work on commission, even FBI agents who might listen to her concerns about the evidence. No one was interested. The case against Ethan looked airtight, and no one wanted to waste time on what appeared to be a guilty man trying to buy his way out of justice. It was during this week of frantic searching that Lila began to notice signs that someone was watching her. Cars that appeared behind her too often, phones that rang with no one on the other end, the feeling of being followed when she walked to her father's hospital room. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia brought on by stress, but then she found the listening device in her hotel room. Someone was monitoring her every move, listening to her conversations, tracking her attempts to help Ethan. Whoever had framed him was making sure she couldn't interfere with their plan. The realization filled her with cold fear. If they were willing to go this far to ensure Ethan's conviction, what else might they do? Would they hurt her father to keep her quiet? Would they hurt her? She confronted Ethan with her discovery that night, showing him the small electronic device she'd found hidden in her lamp. "They're watching me," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Whoever did this to you, they're making sure I can't help you." Ethan's face went white when he saw the listening device. "How long have you been carrying this around?" "I found it this morning." "But Ethan, if they're watching me, maybe we can use that against them." "Maybe we can." "No," he said firmly, crushing the device under his heel. "Absolutely not. You're staying away from this investigation from now on." "I'm not abandoning you," Lila said fiercely. "You're not abandoning me," he replied. "You're staying alive. These people have already destroyed my life. I won't let them destroy yours, too." 3 days later, the indictment came down. Ethan Cole was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and money laundering. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 25 years in federal prison. The night before he was scheduled to turn himself in, they sat together on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city that had been the backdrop for their impossible love story. Tomorrow, he would be taken into custody, and there was no telling when or if they would see each other again. "I need you to promise me something," Ethan said, taking her hand in the darkness. "Anything. Promise me you'll move on," he said quietly. "Promise me you won't waste your life waiting for a man who might never come home." "Don't ask me to promise that," Lila said, her voice breaking. "I love you. I'm not going to stop loving you because some government prosecutor says I should." "Lila, no," she interrupted firmly. "You made your choice when you gave up everything to save my father. Now I'm making mine. I'm going to fight for you, even if you won't fight for yourself." "It's hopeless," he said sadly. "The evidence against me is too strong, and I don't have the resources to counter it properly." "Then I'll find the resources," she said with fierce determination. "I'll find a way to prove your innocence, even if it takes years." They made love that night with desperate intensity, both knowing it might be their last time together for months or even years. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love was precious, a memory to sustain them through the dark times ahead. "I love you," Ethan said as they lay entwined in the pre-dawn darkness. "Whatever happens, whatever they do to me, I want you to know that loving you has been the best thing in my life." "I love you too," Lila replied, holding him as tightly as she could. "And I'm going to bring you home. I don't know how, but I'm going to find a way. Promise me you'll take care of yourself," he said. "Promise me you'll be happy, with or without me." "I promise to take care of myself," she said carefully. "But I can't promise to be happy without you." "Happiness isn't something you can force, Ethan. It's something you find, and I found mine with you." As the sun rose over Miami, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they held each other and tried to memorize the feeling of being together, of being in love, of being whole. In a few hours, federal marshals would come to take Ethan away, and their life together would be reduced to memories and hopes. But as they watched the sunrise from their glass tower above the city, both of them made silent vows. Ethan vowed to be strong, to survive whatever they did to him, to find a way back to the woman he loved. And Lila vowed to never give up, to fight with everything she had, to prove that love could conquer even the most impossible odds. The battle for their future was about to begin, and neither of them was prepared for just how brutal it would be. Chapter 8. Love's Darkest Hour. The federal detention center in Miami was a concrete monolith surrounded by razor wire and guard towers, designed to strip away dignity and hope with brutal efficiency. Lila stood in the visitors' parking lot, staring up at the building where the man she loved was being held, and fought the urge to scream at the injustice of it all. It had been 3 weeks since Ethan's arrest, and she was only now being allowed to visit him. 3 weeks of not knowing if he was safe, if he was eating, if he was surviving the hell of being locked in a cage like an animal. 3 weeks of watching her father recover from his heart surgery while the man who had saved his life was being destroyed by lies. When Ethan was brought in, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame, Lila barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 20 pounds. His face was hollow and drawn, and there was a new hardness in his eyes that broke her heart. This wasn't the confident businessman she'd fallen in love with. This was a man who was being systematically destroyed. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, sitting across from her at the metal table that separated them. "It's not safe for you to be associated with me." "I don't care about safe," Lila replied, fighting back tears at the sight of what prison had done to him. "I care about you. How are you holding up?" "I'm surviving," he said, but she could see the cost of that survival in the tension of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room for threats. "How's your father?" "Getting stronger every day," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. His skin was rough and calloused now, marked by whatever work they were making him do. "The doctors say his recovery is remarkable. He's asking about you constantly." "Tell him I'm fine," Ethan said, squeezing her fingers gently. "Tell him to focus on getting well." "I'm going to prove your innocence," Lila said firmly. "I've hired a private investigator. I'm reviewing all the evidence. I'm going to find whoever did this to you." "Lila, no," Ethan said urgently. "You need to stay away from this investigation. These people are dangerous. They've already proven they'll go to any lengths to destroy me. I won't let them hurt you too. They can't hurt me any worse than they've already hurt you, she said. I'm not giving up on us, Ethan. I'm not walking away. Before he could respond, a guard announced that visiting time was over. They had barely 30 minutes, together 30 minutes, that felt like 30 seconds. And then he was being led away in shackles while she sat alone at the metal table, feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. The private investigator she'd hired was a grizzled ex-cop named Frank Delgado, who specialized in helping the wrongfully accused. He was expensive, more than she could afford, but he was also thorough and experienced in exactly the kind of case they were dealing with. The evidence against your boyfriend is too perfect, he told her during their first meeting. Real criminals make mistakes, leave loose ends. This case is too clean, too neat. Someone spent a lot of time making sure every detail was just right. So, you think he's innocent? I think he's being destroyed by someone who hates him, Frank said bluntly. But thinking it and proving it are two different things. We need to find who really did this, and that's going to take time. Over the next 4 months, Lila threw herself into the search for truth with the desperate energy of someone fighting for survival. She worked endless days, following every lead, talking to anyone who might have information. She'd moved into a tiny studio apartment, surviving on determination and love. The breakthrough came when she discovered the truth about who was destroying Ethan. It wasn't a business rival or a corrupt politician. It was someone much closer to home, Damian Cole, Ethan's adoptive brother, a different person entirely from Victor Lane, her father's corrupt business partner who had died years earlier. The truth was devastating. Damian had been consumed with jealousy his entire life. While Ethan had built an empire from nothing, Damian had always felt entitled to half of everything. He'd been planning this betrayal for years, positioning himself to destroy Ethan and steal everything he'd worked for. Your boyfriend's brother has been setting him up for years, Frank told her when she brought him the evidence. Pure jealousy and greed. But proving it won't be easy. Damian is clever and careful. What about Nathan Hayes, Ethan's former business partner? That's our best bet, Frank agreed. But Hayes disappeared right after Ethan was arrested. Word is he's hiding somewhere, probably scared that Damian will have him killed if he talks. Finding Nathan Hayes became Lila's obsession. She followed every lead, no matter how thin, traveling to cities across the country based on rumors and half-remembered conversations. She maxed out credit cards she couldn't afford, borrowed money from anyone willing to lend it, and pushed her body to the breaking point in her desperate search for the one man who could save Ethan. Meanwhile, her weekly visits to the detention center became increasingly heartbreaking. Ethan was deteriorating both physically and mentally, the stress of prison life wearing him down, despite his efforts to stay strong. He'd been placed in solitary confinement after a fight with another in Mattia fight that Lila suspected had been orchestrated by Damian to isolate him further. You look tired, he said during one visit, his voice hoarse from weeks of barely speaking to anyone. I'm fine. She lied, though she knew he could see through her facade. She'd lost 15 pounds herself, and dark circles under her eyes testified to the sleepless nights she spent researching and investigating. You're killing yourself trying to save me, he said sadly. This isn't what I wanted for you. What you wanted doesn't matter, she replied firmly. What matters is the truth, and I'm going to find it. What if you can't? He asked quietly. What if whoever did this was too smart, too careful? What if there's no evidence to find? Then I'll create new evidence, she said with fierce determination. I'll find another way. I'll never stop fighting for you, Ethan. Never. It was during her 6th month of investigation that Lila finally caught a break. A private investigator in Denver contacted her with news that Nathan Hayes had been spotted in a small mountain town in Colorado, living under an assumed name and working as a construction worker. He's scared, the investigator told her over the phone. Really scared, but he might be willing to talk if you can convince him he'll be protected. Lila was on a plane to Colorado within 12 hours, carrying with her a briefcase full of evidence and a heart full of desperate hope. Nathan Hayes was the key to everything, the one person who could expose Damian's crimes and prove Ethan's innocence. But when she arrived in the tiny mountain town of Cedar Ridge, she discovered that finding Hayes was only half the battle. Convincing him to risk his life to save a man he'd already betrayed would require everything she had left to give. The cabin where Hayes was hiding was 20 miles outside of town, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through dense pine forests. When Lila finally found it, she had to sit in her rental car for several minutes, gathering the courage to walk up to the door and face the man whose testimony could either save the love of her life or destroy her last hope for justice. Nathan Hayes answered the door with a shotgun in his hands, his face gaunt with fear and paranoia. He was barely recognizable as the successful businessman she'd seen in old photographs. Prison and hiding had aged him 20 years in the space of 6 months. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. "If they find out you've contacted me—" "They? Who?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer. "Damian Cole and his people," Hayes replied. "They made it very clear what would happen if I ever testified against them." "Nathan," Lila said gently, "Ethan is dying in prison. Whatever Damian threatened you with, he's already done worse to the man who trusted him like a brother." For the next 3 hours, Lila listened as Nathan Hayes told her the truth about Damian Cole's elaborate scheme to destroy Ethan and steal his empire. It was a story of betrayal that went back years of carefully planted evidence and manipulated witnesses, of a man so consumed with jealousy and greed that he was willing to destroy his own family to get what he wanted. But it was also a story without proof. Hayes had been careful not to keep records of his involvement, and most of the evidence he could provide was circumstantial at best. "I know it's not enough," he said when he finished his confession, "but it's all I have. Damian was too smart to leave a clear trail back to himself." "Then we'll have to make it enough," Lila said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll find a way to use what you've told me." As she drove back down the mountain road, her phone ringing with another call from the detention center that she was too exhausted to answer, Lila felt the weight of 6 months of failure crushing down on her. She had the truth now. But truth without proof was just another story. And stories didn't free innocent men from prison. Her father was waiting for her when she returned to Miami, sitting in the small apartment she could barely afford, his face etched with concern for the daughter who was sacrificing everything for love. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," he said gently. "You're destroying your health, your future, your life. Ethan wouldn't want this for you." "Ethan doesn't get to decide," Lila replied, collapsing into a chair and finally allowing herself to cry. "That man gave up everything to save your life. The least I can do is give up everything to save his—" "Sweetheart," her father said, moving to kneel beside her chair, "that man gave up everything because he loves you. Don't you think he'd rather see you happy and whole than broken and obsessed?" "I can't be happy without him," she said through her tears. "And I can't be whole knowing he's suffering for crimes he didn't commit." "Then find another way," her father said firmly. "If the legal system has failed him, if the evidence isn't enough, then find another way to fight. But don't destroy yourself in the process. The world needs more people like you people who fight for justice, who love without reservation, who never give up hope. Don't let them win by breaking you." As Lila sat in her father's arms, crying for the man she loved and the justice that seemed impossible to achieve, she made a new vow. She would find another way to save Ethan, even if it meant taking risks that could destroy them both. Because some loves were worth fighting for, no matter the cost, and some fights were worth having, even when victory seemed impossible. Chapter 9. The Deepest Wounds. The evidence that finally freed Ethan Cole came from the most unexpected source, Damian Cole's own computer, discovered by FBI agents during a raid on his luxury penthouse in Manhattan. Hidden in encrypted files were years of carefully documented plans to destroy his adoptive brother, complete with forged documents, bribed witnesses, and detailed timelines of his elaborate scheme of betrayal and revenge. Lila was in the courthouse when the charges against Ethan were officially dropped, watching as prosecutors announced that they had been pursuing an innocent man while the real criminal had been manipulating their investigation from the beginning. Damian Cole was arrested that same day, though he would never stand trial. He was found dead in his cell 3 days later, an apparent suicide that left more questions than answers. "He's free," the prosecutor told Lila after the hearing, his voice heavy with regret. "All charges have been dismissed, and Mr. Cole will be released immediately. We owe him an apology that can never be adequate." Lila should have felt triumphant. After 8 months of fighting, investigating, and refusing to give up, she had proven Ethan's innocence and brought down the man who had destroyed his life. But as she stood outside the detention center waiting for his release, All she felt was a deep, gnawing anxiety about what 8 months in federal prison had done to the man she loved. The stories she'd heard from other inmates' families were horrifying. Accounts of men who went into the system as one person and came out as someone else entirely, broken by violence, isolation, and the constant struggle to survive in an environment designed to strip away humanity. Ethan had spent the last 4 months in solitary confinement, locked in a cell barely larger than a closet, with human contact limited to the guards who delivered his meals through a slot in the door. When the prison doors finally opened and Ethan walked out, Lila barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, his once powerful frame now gaunt and hollow. His dark hair had grown long and unkempt, and his eyes, those beautiful gray eyes she'd fallen in love with, were dead and empty, like those of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. But worst of all was the way he looked at her when he saw her waiting for him. There was no joy, no relief, no happiness at being reunited with the woman who had fought so hard to free him. Instead, there was something that looked almost like fear, as if her presence was a threat rather than a comfort. "Lila," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You shouldn't be here." "Where else would I be?" she asked, moving toward him with her arms outstretched. But he stepped back, avoiding her touch, and the rejection cut through her like a knife. "I don't want to see you," he said flatly. "I don't want to see anyone. I just want to be left alone." "Ethan, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I've missed you so much. I've been fighting for months to prove your innocence, and now I'm free," he interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion. "Thank you for that. But that's where it ends. I don't want your pity, and I don't want your charity. I just want you to leave me alone." He turned and began walking away, his shoulders hunched as if he was still expecting to be attacked. Lila stood frozen in shock, watching the man she loved disappear into the Miami streets like a ghost. For 3 weeks, she tried to find him. She checked every hotel, every shelter, every place she could think of where he might have gone. But Ethan Cole had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him up, leaving behind only questions and a broken heart. It was her father who finally found him, during one of his volunteer shifts at a homeless shelter in downtown Miami. Thomas Grant had been working with the shelter as part of his own recovery, helping to serve meals and provide basic medical care to people who had nowhere else to turn. When he called Lila with the news, his voice was heavy with sorrow. "I found him, sweetheart," he said, "but you need to prepare yourself. He's not the man you remember." The Harbor Hope Shelter was a converted warehouse in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a place where society's most forgotten people came for a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. Lila had to show identification and sign in as a visitor. And even then, the staff was reluctant to let her see Ethan. "He's been with us for 2 weeks, the shelter director explained. "Doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't participate in any of our programs. He just sits in the corner during mealtimes and stares at the wall. We're worried about him. He's showing signs of severe depression and PTSD." Lila found him in the shelter's main room, sitting alone at a table in the corner with an untouched tray of food in front of him. The transformation was even more shocking than it had been at the prison. He was thinner now, almost skeletal, and his clothes-donated items that didn't fit properly hung on his frame like rags. His hair was longer and more disheveled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept properly in months. "Ethan," she said softly, sitting down across from him at the plastic table. He looked up at her with those dead eyes, and for a moment, she thought he didn't recognize her. Then something flickered in his expression, pain, maybe, or regret before the emptiness returned. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place isn't for people like you." "I'm here because you're here," she said gently. "I've been looking for you for weeks." "Stop looking," he said, pushing his untouched food away. "Stop caring. Stop trying to save me." "I can't do that," Lila said, fighting back tears at the sight of what he'd become. "I love you." "No, you don't," he said with quiet conviction. "You love the memory of who I used to be, but that man is gone, Lila. Prison killed him, and what's left isn't worth saving." "That's not true." "Look at me," he said suddenly, his voice rising enough to attract attention from other shelter residents. "Really look at me. I'm broken, Lila. I'm toxic. Everything I touch turns to poison. I destroyed my brother. I destroyed my business. I destroyed everyone who ever trusted me. Damien destroyed himself. Lila said firmly. You were the victim, not the perpetrator. Was I? Ethan asked with bitter irony. Because it feels like I'm the one who survived while everyone else paid the price. Damien is dead. Nathan Hayes is in witness protection, terrified for his life. Dozens of people lost their jobs when my companies collapsed. And you, his voice broke slightly, you wasted 8 months of your life fighting for someone who wasn't worth fighting for. Don't you dare say that, Lila said fiercely. Don't you dare tell me that loving you was a waste of time. It was, he said flatly. Because the man you love doesn't exist anymore. Prison changes you. Lila. It strips away everything human and leaves behind something else, something ugly and violent and broken. I don't believe that, she said, reaching across the table to take his hand, but he pulled away from her touch as if it burned him. I've hurt people, he said quietly. In prison, I did things I never thought I was capable of doing. I hurt people to survive, and I felt nothing when I did it. That's what I am now, someone who can cause pain without feeling it. You're a survivor, Lila said desperately. You did what you had to do to stay alive. No, Ethan said, shaking his head slowly. I'm a monster, and monsters don't get to have happy endings. They don't get to love or be loved. They just exist in the shadows, hurting everything they touch. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. I need you to do something for me, he said, not looking at her. I need you to forget about me. Find someone else, someone who deserves your love. Get married, have children, be happy, but do it without me. Ethan, please don't do this, Lila said, standing as well. Don't push me away. We can work through this together. There is no together, he said firmly. There's just you, with your whole life ahead of you, and me, with nothing but ghosts and regrets. I won't drag you down with me. You're not dragging me anywhere, she said, following him as he moved toward the shelter's exit. I'm choosing to be here. I'm choosing you. Then you're choosing wrong, he said, pausing at the door to look back at her one last time. You deserve so much more than what I can give you. You deserve someone who can love you without destroying you. The only thing destroying me is watching you give up, she said, tears streaming down her face. Please, Ethan, let me help you. Let me love you. For a moment, she thought she saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of the man she'd fallen in love with, but then it was gone, replaced by the hollow emptiness that prison had carved into his soul. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry for everything. And then he was gone, walking out into the Miami night rain that had begun to fall, leaving Lila standing alone in a homeless shelter with her heart breaking all over again. She followed him outside, calling his name, but he'd already disappeared into the maze of dark streets and alleyways that made up Miami's underbelly. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the streets into rivers and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Ethan! She screamed into the storm, her voice lost in the thunder and rain. Please don't do this. Please don't leave me. But there was no answer except the sound of rain on concrete and the distant rumble of thunder. The man she loved had walked away from her, convinced that he was protecting her by destroying himself, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Lila wondered if she was strong enough to save someone who didn't want to be saved. She stood in the rain for nearly an hour, soaked to the skin and shivering with cold, hoping against hope that he would come back. But the streets remained empty, except for the occasional homeless person seeking shelter from the storm. When she finally gave up and returned to her car, Lila felt more defeated than she had at any point during the 8 months she'd spent fighting for his freedom. Legal battles could be won with evidence and determination. But how do you fight against someone's will to be destroyed? How do you save someone who has convinced himself that he's beyond salvation? As she drove through the flooded streets toward her small apartment, Lila made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wouldn't give up on Ethan Cole, no matter how far he fell or how hard he pushed her away. Love wasn't just about the good times and the easy moments. It was about refusing to abandon someone when they were at their worst. But she also knew that the battle to save him was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The hardest fight of her life was still ahead, and she wasn't sure either of them would survive it. Chapter 10. Love's Resurrection. 6 months after Ethan walked away into the rain, Lila had learned to live with a heart that felt permanently broken. She'd thrown herself into finishing her architecture degree, using the insurance settlement from Ethan's wrongful imprisonment to pay for school and support herself. During the day, she attended classes and worked on designs for low-income housing projects. At night, she worried about a man who had vanished into Miami's shadows, refusing all her attempts to help him directly, but she helped him anyway in ways he'd never know. She'd found a network of homeless advocates and social workers who kept track of the city's most vulnerable residents, and through them, she made sure Ethan had access to meals, medical care, and shelter when he needed it. She donated money anonymously to the programs that served him, ensuring that the man she loved wouldn't freeze to death or starve on the streets, even if he refused to let her love him openly. Her father had recovered remarkably well from his heart transplant, returning to work part-time as a consultant for architectural firms throughout South Florida. But on a humid Tuesday morning in late August, everything changed in an instant. "Dad!" Lila called out when she arrived at his apartment for their weekly lunch and found him collapsed on the kitchen floor, unconscious and barely breathing. The ambulance ride to Coastal Mercy felt like a nightmare replay of that horrible night during Hurricane Nora, but this time the crisis was even more severe. Her father was experiencing acute rejection of his transplanted heart, a complication that could kill him within hours if not treated aggressively. "We need to perform emergency surgery to stabilize the rejection," Dr. Vargas explained as they rushed her father into the ER. "But he's lost a significant amount of blood, and his type is extremely rare. We're checking our blood bank now, but—" "AB negative," Lila said, her heart sinking. "He's AB negative. There are only a handful of people in Miami with that blood type. We'll put out an emergency call," the doctor assured her. "Sometimes people respond quickly to these situations." But as the hours passed, no donors came forward. Lila sat in the ICU waiting room, watching her father's condition deteriorate while doctors worked frantically to keep him alive with artificial support. Then she remembered, during their time together, she'd seen Ethan's medical information when he'd registered as her emergency contact. AB, negative the same, impossibly rare blood type. Finding him required calling in every favor she'd accumulated over the past 6 months. The homeless advocates, the shelter workers, the social service coordinator everyone who might have seen him recently. The trail led to a condemned building near the Miami River, where several homeless individuals had been squatting in the ruins of what had once been a warehouse. Lila found Ethan in a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and tarps, sharing his meager space with an elderly woman and 2 children whose mother had abandoned them on the streets. He was thinner than ever, his clothes little more than rags, but his eyes showed a flicker of recognition when he saw her approaching. "Lila," he said quietly, not seeming surprised by her appearance. "Is he?" "He's dying," she said simply. "Acute organ rejection. He needs blood. And you're the only compatible donor in the city." Ethan was on his feet immediately, not bothering to gather what few possessions he had. "Let's go." The drive to the hospital was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Lila stole glances at him, noting the way his hands shook slightly, whether from malnutrition, withdrawal, or simple nerves. She couldn't tell. But despite his physical deterioration, there was something different about him, something that hadn't been there 6 months ago. A quiet strength, perhaps, or maybe just the peace that comes from hitting bottom and finding there's nowhere left to fall. At the hospital, Ethan submitted to the blood donation process without question. Lying on the medical table as pint after pint of his blood was collected for immediate transfusion to her father. The medical staff recognized him some, had been there during her father's original treatment, but they said nothing about his changed circumstances, maintaining professional discretion despite their obvious shock at his appearance. "Thank you," Lila said as they waited for news about her father's surgery. "I know things between us are complicated, but there's nothing complicated about saving someone's life." Ethan interrupted gently. "I'd do anything for him. He's a good man who deserves to live." "So are you," she said quietly. "You're a good man who deserves to live, too." Ethan looked at her with those hollow eyes that had haunted her dreams for months. "No, Lila, I'm not. I'm a man who's done terrible things, who's hurt people, who destroys everything he touches. Your father is innocent. I'm not." "You're wrong," Lila said firmly. You're a man who sacrificed everything to save someone else's life. You're a man who just gave his blood to save that same person again. You're a man who's been living on the streets, but still finds ways to help other people." She gestured toward the waiting room, where the elderly woman and 2 children from his makeshift shelter sat nervously on plastic chairs. "Clara told me what you've been doing," Lila continued. "How you've been taking the money I've been leaving for you through the shelter programs and giving it to families with children. How you've been protecting people who are weaker than you, even when you barely have enough to survive yourself." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan said, but his eyes gave him away. "You've been my guardian angel's guardian angel," Lila said with a sad smile, watching over the people I've been trying to help, making sure the resources actually reach the ones who need them most. Before he could respond, Dr. Vargas appeared with news about her father's surgery. The blood transfusion had worked. The rejection had been stopped. And Thomas Grant was going to survive. "He's asking for both of you," the doctor said, looking between Lila and Ethan with obvious curiosity about their relationship. Her father looked small and fragile in the ICU bed, but his eyes were clear and grateful when he saw them approaching. "Thank you," he said to Ethan, his voice weak but sincere. "For everything, for all of it." "You don't need to thank me," Ethan replied quietly. "You would have done the same." "No," her father said, struggling to sit up slightly. "I need to say this. You saved my life twice, and then you disappeared because you thought you were protecting my daughter. But you've been protecting her all along, haven't you? Making sure she was safe. Making sure she had what she needed." Ethan didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. "She's been dying without you," her father continued. "Slowly, quietly, but dying all the same. And you've been dying without her? So, whatever noble sacrifice you think you're making, whatever protection you think you're providing, stop it. Life is too short, and love is too rare to waste on pride and fear." As her father drifted off to sleep, Lila followed Ethan out of the ICU and down the familiar corridors of Coastal Mercy Hospital. They walked in silence until they reached the hospital chapel, the same small room where she'd prayed desperately during her father's first crisis. Outside, another fierce thunderstorm was beginning. Rain lashing against the stained glass windows and thunder rumbling overhead like the voice of an angry god. It seemed fitting, somehow. Their love story had been punctuated by storms from the very beginning. "I need to go," Ethan said, pausing at the chapel entrance. "Clara and the kids need—" "No," Lila said firmly, stepping in front of him to block his path. "You don't get to walk away this time. Not again. Lila, please don't make this harder than it has to be. You think you destroy everything you touch?" she said, her voice rising with emotion. "Look at my father alive because of you. Look at Clara and those children safe because of you. Look at me. I've never loved anyone the way I love you. You don't destroy, Ethan. You save. You heal. You love so fiercely it scares you. I hurt people in prison," he said desperately. "I did things. You survived," she interrupted. "You did what you had to do to stay alive. And I'm grateful for that. Because it means you're here now. It means I still have the chance to love you." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the chapel in stark black and white. In that moment of elemental drama, something shifted in Ethan's expression. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crack, and she could see the man she'd fallen in love with struggling to break free from the prison of his own guilt and shame. "I'm broken," he whispered. "I'm so broken. I don't know how to put the pieces back together." "Then let me help," she said, stepping closer to him. "Let me love the broken pieces until they heal. Let me choose you." Ethan broken. Scared. Homeless. "I choose you. Every day, every storm, every fear, I choose us. I have nothing to offer you," he said, tears finally starting to fall. "No money, no home, no future that makes sense. You have yourself," she said firmly. "You have your heart, your strength, your ability to love people so completely, you'd sacrifice everything for them. That's all I've ever wanted." When he tried to turn away, she followed him toward the chapel doors. The storm outside was growing stronger, rain coming down in sheets that made it impossible to see the parking lot beyond the hospital entrance. "Where are you going?" she called after him as he pushed through the doors into the hurricane-force winds. "I don't know," he shouted back over the thunder. "Away from you, away from everyone I could hurt." But Lila followed him into the storm, just as she'd followed him through every crisis they'd faced together. The rain soaked through her clothes instantly, and she had to fight against the wind to stay on her feet. But she kept moving toward him. "I choose you," she screamed into the tempest, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "Broken, scared, homeless, I choose you. Every day, every storm, every fear, I choose us." Lightning struck a transformer nearby, showering them both with sparks. In that moment of elemental fury, Ethan's walls finally crumbled completely. He turned back to her, his arms outstretched, and they collided in the middle of the storm like two planets finally finding their proper orbit. They held each other in the rain, both sobbing, both broken, both finally admitting that they couldn't survive without each other. The storm raged around them, but for the first time in months, both of them felt completely safe. "I love you," Ethan said against her hair, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "I love you too," she replied, holding him as tightly as she could. "And I'm never letting go again." 2 years later, they stood in that same hospital chapel, exchanging wedding vows as Hurricane Celeste battered the Florida coast outside. It seemed fitting that they would marry during a storm. Their entire love story had been shaped by tempests, each one marking a crucial moment in their journey together. They'd found each other in chaos, fought for each other through disaster, and learned that their love was strong enough to weather any storm. Ethan wore a simple black suit, his body healthy again after months of proper nutrition and medical care. Lila wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, with her mother's ring on her finger, the same ring she'd once pawned to try to save him. The guest list was small but meaningful. Her father, serving as both father of the bride and best man. Clara and her children, now living in the first house built by the Lila Grant Foundation for Sustainable Housing. A handful of friends and colleagues who had supported them through their darkest times. "Do you, Ethan Cole, take Lila Grant to be your wife?" the hospital chaplain asked, his voice competing with the thunder outside. "I do," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "In storms and sunshine, in sickness and health, in poverty and prosperity, I choose her today and always. Do you, Lila Grant, take Ethan Cole to be your husband?" "I do," she replied, her voice strong and clear. "I choose him broken and whole, in darkness and light. I choose us, no matter what storms may come." When they kissed, lightning illuminated the stained glass windows, and thunder rolled overhead like a blessing from the universe itself. They'd survived the worst that life could throw at them, and they'd done it together. Their love story had begun with a hurricane and a desperate race through flooded streets. It had been tested by betrayal, separation, and the kind of pain that breaks most people, but it had endured, growing stronger with each trial, proving that some loves are powerful enough to resurrect the dead parts of our souls and make us whole again. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife to the sound of rain against the windows, both Lila and Ethan knew that they would face whatever storms came next the same way they'd faced all the others, together, unafraid, and absolutely certain that their love could weather anything. Outside, Hurricane Celeste began to weaken and move on. But inside the chapel, two hearts that had found their home in each other beat as one, stronger than any storm could ever be.